Hello, welcome to the Steelyard. My name is Ben Filchek, I'm the studio director here, and today we're going to be talking about the plasma cutter. First thing, I just wanted to point out a little bit of our PPE, which is very similar to other processes in the shop. So we're going to have some leather gloves today, and I'm going to be wearing a visor. This is a Shade 5 visor, not quite as dark as a welding helmet. We don't need the Shade 10 for the plasma cutter, but Shade 5 is good. I'm going to use a visor today just because I wear glasses and I find it a little bit more comfortable. But there are also Shade 5 safety glasses that are also perfectly fine to use when we do the plasma cutter. Specifically, right now we're looking at the back of our plasma cutter. This particular plasma cutter, the on-off power switch is on the back of the machine. We are also looking at an a quick release for an air hose. So a plasma cutter works by creating an arc of electricity and then a high pressure stream of air is mixed with that arc, and that's what creates our little laser almost that will pierce and cut our metal. Specifically, it's called the plasma cutter because it is the same as the plasma on the sun. Like I said, this is the back of the machine, so if we're looking for our on-off switch, it's towards the back, and then we're also looking at this air valve. You may be familiar with a quick release like this. This is very specific to air compressors and being able to use air tools. For us to be able to use the plasma cutter, we have to slide this sleeve back and connect just like this. Circle on this machine means off. The line right here means on. So I've just now turned the machine on. What I'm going to do is now I'm going to show us the front of our plasma cutter, which we can see a small little screen right here and two different knobs. So there's a couple different settings on this machine. Specifically, we want to use the plasma cutter, which there are the other types of the other functions on this machine are for this little dot dash function is for cutting something like expanded metal or like metal grate. So basically the arc kind of starts and stops. This particular function right here is, and you can see there's that there is, the arc is piercing a piece of metal, so that's a plasma cutter setting. This third setting down here is actually what's called a gouging setting. So what it would actually do is gouge a channel into some metal, or it would gouge away a weld. Probably we'll never need to use this if we're just wanting a plasma cut. And then this function right here is for if this machine was hooked up to a plasma cam table. Again, we will never use this. We'll keep this on our plasma cut function. The next knob is what controls the amps of this machine. So we can think of that in a couple of ways. The lower the amps, the thinner the metal, the thicker the metal, higher the amps. Particularly here at the Steelyard, this machine can go up to about 65 amps. We will probably never need to go up towards that number. That'll cut around 3/4 thick of steel. Probably the highest we should ever turn this machine up here in the studio is around 50. Today I'm going to be cutting a piece of about 16 gauge steel, and I'm probably going to start that at around 30 to 35 amps. We'll put it on the 30 and we can see what happens. Much like a MIG welder, we have a ground clamp that we can either attach to our work surface or to the piece that we're actually physically going to cut. So this is our torch, cutting torch. Today, we're gonna be using a drag tip on our cutting torch. And what that means is I can make contact with the piece that I'm cutting and I can drag it across my piece. I don't need to hover above my piece, I can actually make contact. And the way that I know that this is a drag tip is if we look at side profile, we can see these little channels in our tip. And we can kind of see a little orifice down in the center of this. And what these little channels and what this little copper object does is it's kind of a standoff. So it keeps that tip on the inside from completely making contact with our metal and allows us to have the right distance when we go to cut. There's another feature on this plasma torch, which is right here. This little flap right here, this is a safety. So if I were to put this torch down on the table, it wouldn't just by accident hit the trigger and start cutting. So when I start to cut and use this plasma cutter, I will take my finger and I'll flip this up and then be able to pull the trigger. So we're looking again at the back of the plasma cutter. We're going to attach our air hose. So this is compressed air coming from the air compressor. Slid the sleeve back, slid it on. It should be like, it should connect like that. It should not just pop off if I pull on it. Sometimes when we're working with a plasma cutter, the input is referred to as gas. We're going to think of our gas as air. Here at the Steelyard, we do have a zone where we have compressed air coming from an air compressor down in the basement. There is a valve here on this pipe that helps control the on and off of our gas of our air supply. This type of valve is called a ball valve. Whenever you see a ball valve with a handle like this running perfectly parallel to that pipe, that means it's on. Whenever you see a ball valve that's perpendicular to the pipe that it's on, that means it's off. So if and when we need to, we can come over here, we can turn on our air supply. We know that it's connected and we will be ready to start plasma cutting. Myself a little room. We talked a little bit about our ground clamp. This, again, can be either clipped to our working surface or to the metal that we want to cut. Right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect my ground to my working surface, and then the metal I want to cut, I'm going to make contact with our metal surface that we now have our ground hooked up to. This particular table right here is actually what's called a downdraft fume extractor. So the idea is there is a big fan and filter inside this unit that actually pulls the air through this table. So this metal grate that I have attached to, I can now create a space where all the air is being pulled down through this table and it's pulling away any smoke, any dust, any fumes. So we have our downdraft table. I'm going to use this table today because it's very good to use because it, again, will extract any dust, any smoke, any debris, such that when we're cutting. This space is limited to the type of pieces we're cutting. We don't always need to cut on the downdraft table, but when given the option, we want to use it. We do have other tables out in the studio where if we need to cut a big sheet, we could easily cut out in the middle of the studio. But for today, we're going to use the downdraft table. There is a switch on the side that turns this table on. And now we're sucking air through our table. So we talked a little bit, or we've talked about the downdraft table, which pulls air through this metal grate into a filter, which will help us extract any smoke or debris. Today I just have a scrap piece of metal. It's about 16 gauge, so it's, you know, it's on the thicker side. I have my ground. I have my ground clamped to the table, and I have my torch out and out of the way. I've made sure that the cable and everything is kind of nice, and I have enough space for my feet. I'm not going to get tangled up in the cable. And I also have my gloves and my Shade 5 helmet on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the machine, and then I'm going to turn on the downdraft table. Now I'm ready to cut. So you can see air is still coming out of the nozzle after I've stopped cutting. That is to cool the torch down. So that's absolutely supposed to happen. You can see how it just stopped. So that excess air that's coming through the nozzle as I'm finishing cutting is safety for the machine, where it's cooling down everything that's in this torch and keeping everything in good working order. So I was able to just cut this chunk off this steel, so it's great for making straight cuts. I could also do things like draw or write letters, which I'll demonstrate right now. So I was able to write some letters. We can see that there's some slag around the letters and not quite completely pierced through the back. What that could indicate to me is maybe I want to turn up my amp on my plasma cutter. So I started at 30 amps cutting around this 16 gauge piece of steel. I might want to turn it up to 40 and just see the difference in the way that my material cuts. Something to think about when you're using the plasma cutter is to vary your amperage to, you know, create a cleaner cut, to create a cut with less slag, things like that.